One feature of the history of old Russia was the continual beating she suffered for falling behind. She was beaten by the Mongol Khans. She was beaten by the Turkish Beys. She was beaten by the Swedish feudal lords. She was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian gentry. She was beaten by the British and French capitalists. She was beaten by the Japanese barons. All beat her for her backwardness. For military backwardness, for cultural backwardness, for political backwardness, for industrial backwardness, for agricultural backwardness. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed. These are the words of Joseph Stalin spoken in 1931 during the first five-year plan of industrialization in the Soviet Union. How sincere these words were remains a subject of debate. Did the Soviet leader genuinely fear aggression from Western powers, or did he dream of building a military war machine to subjugate other nations himself? Whatever the case, these words proved eerily prophetic. Exactly 10 years later, the Soviet state faced the aggression of an advanced Western power and came dangerously close to total destruction. The primary force that allowed the nation to withstand the German war machine was Soviet industry. The 1920s. The young Soviet state, formed in 1922, lay in ruins and extreme poverty. Behind it were World War I, the February Revolution that overthrew the Tsarist regime, the Bolshevik Revolution that brought the communists to power, a brutal civil war, the Red Terror that engulfed all of Russia, and the Polish-Soviet War. All these upheavals, occurring in less than 10 years, brought unprecedented devastation, chaos, famine, and claimed millions of lives. According to various estimates, between 12 and 16 million people perished on the territory of the former Russian Empire during this period. The newly formed state was in a desperate situation. Industrial production was at a mere 15 to 20% of Tsarist Russia's 1913 levels. The production of steel, pig iron, and coal, the key commodities of that era, had dropped to shockingly low levels, around 10 to 30% of pre-war output. Railway transport volume fell to 20% of 1913 levels due to destroyed bridges, damaged tracks, and the malfunction of nearly 60% of the nation's locomotive fleet. By 1922, gross agricultural output dropped to 60% of pre-war levels, and cultivated land shrank by nearly a third. Hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and urban depopulation followed. As factories stood idle, urban dwellers fled to the countryside just to survive. Petrograd's population plummeted from 2.5 million to just 720,000. Moscow's fell from 2 million to around 1 million. To make matters worse, the USSR found itself under an international financial and credit blockade. Western nations rejected the Bolshevik regime, which had repudiated Tsarist foreign debts and nationalized foreign enterprises. These restrictions prevented the Soviets from securing long-term loans, while Western trade partners demanded immediate payment in gold reserves of which were critically depleted. It would be fair to say that pre-revolutionary Russia was also a backward agrarian nation. Before World War I, Russia did indeed rank fifth in global industrial output and belonged to the club of developed powers. However, the gap between fifth place and the top positions was immense. On a per capita production basis, Russia lagged behind the United States by about 8 to 10 times, and behind France, its closest competitor on the list, by a factor of 3. In 1913, about 80% of the population were rural residents, and the agrarian sector accounted for 55% of national income. In Great Britain, the picture was diametrically opposite. Only 20% of the population remained rural. Despite a major economic spurt in the late 19th century, Russia remained a deeply agrarian, backward empire with a vast rural population that grew rapidly, but despite economic progress, became increasingly impoverished as available land per person dwindled. Eventually, These contradictions erupted into the overthrow of the Tsar and the rise of the communists, who promised land to the peasants and fair labor conditions in state-owned factories to the workers. The Bolsheviks inherited the problems of the Russian Empire, but like the previous government, they did not know how to solve them. The policy of war communism, under which up to 70% of peasant harvests were forcibly requisitioned, and private trade and entrepreneurship were banned even in their smallest forms, soon led to mass peasant rebellions, famine, and severe goods shortages. To preserve their grip on power, Lenin persuaded the party to replace war communism with the new economic policy, NEP. The NEP was essentially a strategic retreat to micro-level capitalism. Peasants were allowed to sell surplus grain on the open market, small private businesses were permitted, and foreign investors were invited to lease Soviet enterprises. While the NEP stabilized the country, it failed to satisfy party leadership. Under the system, the state was supposed to trade manufactured goods for surplus grain, but because Soviet industry remained weak, it could not produce enough goods to entice peasants to sell. Cities faced food shortages, triggering worker discontent, the very class the Bolsheviks claimed to represent. In response, the state artificially suppressed grain procurement prices while inflating prices for industrial goods. The result: peasants simply refused to sell their grain to state agents. The economic cycle broke down. The NEP had reached its limit. The Red Party leadership held contrasting views on the country's future development. One faction, led by Nikolai Bukharin, advocated for an evolutionary industrialization. They believed industrialization should proceed naturally through market mechanisms, where the primary source of capital for industry would be the wealthy peasant who bought industrial goods and paid taxes. The second group of Bolsheviks, led by Leon Trotsky, considered this path far too long and dangerous. Since the Soviet Union was surrounded by hostile capitalist nations, they argued that a rapid industrial leap was necessary at any cost. They advocated for superindustrialization, accelerated construction, primarily of heavy and military industry, through centralized state planning by siphoning capital out of the agrarian sector into industry. In other words, through the outright plunder of the peasantry. Stalin, who after Lenin's death managed to systematically concentrate full state and party power in his hands, initially opposed forced industrialization, and Trotsky, coming out in defense of the peasants. However, after crushing Trotsky and consolidating his own position, he executed a sharp political pivot. Faced with the grain procurement crisis of 1927-1928, when the market mechanisms of the NEP failed to supply the cities and the army with the required amount of food, the General Secretary effectively adopted the program of his former opponents, but gave it a far more radical and ruthless character. Instead of gradually accumulating capital through the development of light industry, as demanded by the right opposition led by Bukharin, Stalin initiated the transition to the policy of the Great Break. The core of this policy was the total nationalization and state control of the economy. All previously granted freedoms for private entrepreneurs, artisans, factory owners, workshop operators, and peasants were abolished. The state was set to launch the construction of entirely new industrial sectors that simply did not exist in the Soviet Union before, vastly increase production across all product lines, and begin manufacturing modern machinery. Yet despite these ambitious plans, the country remained in dire poverty. The population was still overwhelmingly rural and illiterate, while science and education had been shattered. The only highly educated strata of society, aristocrats, czarist officers, and industrialists, had mostly been liquidated or had fled the country. The nation clearly lacked technology, scientists, and engineers capable of creating entire industrial branches and building complex manufacturing plants. To make matters worse, the Soviet government was an international outcast, and expecting help from abroad seemed naive. Nevertheless, luck favored the Soviets. At the exact time the Soviet Union began its industrialization effort, the Great Depression struck the United States. Thousands of American engineers found themselves unemployed, and construction companies were left without contracts. This was an opportunity the Soviet leadership could not afford to miss. They sought to attract engineers from the world's most industrially advanced nation, possessing the most cutting-edge technologies and experience in large-scale construction. Since there were no official diplomatic relations between the US and the USSR until 1933, all recruitment and procurement efforts were handled by the Amtorg Trading Corporation, formally a commercial entity, but in reality a substitute for a diplomatic mission. The company published advertisements in American newspapers offering jobs in the Soviet Union and directly approached American corporations, promising golden contracts. Indeed, to lure valuable specialists, the Soviet leadership offered generous terms. Through the mediation of Amtorg, a group of Soviet engineers traveled to Detroit in 1928 and offered Albert Kahn Inc. a contract to design industrial plants and train Russian engineers in modern technologies for an astronomical $2 billion in modern value. Kahn was considered the premier industrial architect of the United States. He had already built massive plants for the Ford Motor Company and was regarded as the father of Detroit's industrial architecture. He owned the world's largest architectural engineering firm, capable of designing blueprints for a plan of any scale and managing its full construction and production setup cycle. For Albert Kahn, this was an extremely lucrative contract, and he agreed. By 1928, he arrived in Moscow and opened a branch of his firm there under a secretive Russian name, Gospodstroy. The Soviet government officially announced a political course aimed at transforming the USSR from a country that imports machinery into a country that produces machinery. The official start was marked in the autumn of 1928 with the announcement of the first five-year plan, a set deadline according to which industrialization was to proceed. Centralized resource allocation for construction was launched, along with the mass import of foreign machinery and the kickoff of the first giant construction projects. On a wave of propaganda slogans, Stalin demanded a drastic increase in the already fantastic plan targets, pushing to complete the five-year plan ahead of schedule. At its inception, Gospodstroy employed 25 American engineers who drafted industrial blueprints and passed their expertise on to Soviet engineers. Under Kahn's master plan, a construction program for the first five-year plan was formulated. All equipment for the new factories was manufactured in the U.S., shipped on cargo steamers to the USSR, and assembled inside pre-constructed buildings under the supervision of Kahn's staff. The design of the Stalingrad tractor plant was ordered from American engineers in 1928. The plant was designed in record time, prefabricated in the U.S., then dismantled, shipped to Soviet Russia, and reassembled on site under the supervision of Kahn's engineers. In 1929, the Council of People's Commissars passed a decree to build another massive tractor plant in the Urals. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant was meant to exceed the output of the Stalingrad and Kharkiv tractor plants combined by 4 times. Naturally, the Soviets could not execute such a project on their own, so they turned to Kahn's specialists once again. In Detroit, a specialized design bureau called Chelyabinsk Tractor Plant was set up, where American and Soviet engineers jointly developed the master plan for the giant facility. Construction took 3 years. Nearly 300 firms from Germany, the US, France, and Britain participated in equipping the plant. In 1933, the plant was officially opened, the largest industrial project in the USSR at the time. In 1929, the Soviet Ministry of Economy signed a landmark agreement with the Ford Motor Company to cooperate in setting up mass automobile production in the USSR. The Gorky Automobile Plant, GAZ, built in a record 18 months by 1932, was a direct copy of Henry Ford's famous River Rouge plant in Detroit. In addition to blueprints for factories and assembly lines, Ford provided vehicle blueprints. The Soviets eagerly copied, sometimes legally, sometimes without licenses, Western technology designs. For example, the GAZY, the most mass-produced Soviet truck of the 1930s and 1940s, was a licensed copy of the American Ford Model AA. The GAZA passenger car was a licensed copy of the 1927 Ford Model A. The executive ZIS-101 limousine, driven by the entire Soviet elite until the late 1930s, was a complete copy of the 1932 Buick. The SDZ-1530 and Stalinet 60 tractors were licensed copies of the American McCormick Deering and Caterpillar 60 models. This is far from an exhaustive list. The American firm Albert Kahn Inc. designed approximately 600 industrial enterprises during the first five-year plan, while a total of nearly 1,500 factories were constructed across the USSR with the help of foreign companies. Another American engineer, Hugh Cooper, became the chief consultant for the construction of the Dnieper hydroelectric station, Dnepro-GES. He personally supervised the installation of American turbines manufactured by General Electric and generators from Newport News. Dnepro-GES was not merely the largest hydroelectric power station in Europe. It was the supreme symbol of the entire first five-year plan and a demonstration of the ambitions of this new type of state. The massive concrete dam, constructed with the involvement of American engineers and equipped with foreign machinery, was designed to convert the energy of the Dnieper River into electricity, without which the newly built factories of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic could not operate. When the station opened in 1932, many foreign journalists were astonished by the scale of the project. For the young Soviet industry, Dnepro-GES became the ultimate symbol of entry into the club of advanced industrial powers. In 1932, the Soviet leadership officially declared that the first five-year plan had been completed ahead of schedule, in 4 years and 3 months. However, the real picture was complex. The average fulfillment rate for heavy industry targets was roughly 60 to 70% of the declared requirements. By 1932, Stalin's maximalist goals for pig iron, coal, steel, tractors, and automobiles had not been met. Industry had grown several-fold, but not tenfold as the slogans had demanded, though the original minimum baseline plan was largely fulfilled. Despite failing to meet the maximum plan figures, the industrial leap was colossal. The Soviet Union built automobile, tractor, aviation, machine tool, and chemical industries completely from scratch. True industrial giants were launched, some of which continue to operate to this day. The second five-year plan was launched in 1933. By this time, hundreds of factories had already been constructed, so the primary emphasis shifted from sheer construction to integrating these facilities into a complex ecosystem, establishing mass production, solving logistical bottlenecks, training former uneducated peasants to operate complex imported machinery, and producing hundreds of thousands of qualified specialists capable of maintaining modern industries. This is not to say that new construction ceased. During the second five-year plan, major facilities continued to be built. During these years, the giants laid down at the end of the first five-year plan were completed and commissioned, along with brand-new industrial capacity. Uralmash, a giant heavy machinery plant launched in 1933 that manufactured equipment for the entire metallurgical sector of the USSR. Uralvagonzavod, launched in 1936 to produce railway cars, and later converted to manufacture tanks during World War II. Zaporizhstal and Azovstal, massive steel manufacturing plants built in Ukraine. A landmark event was the opening of the first line of the Moscow Metro in 1935. The Soviet leadership understood how expensive industrialization was costing the country. Due to equipment purchases during the first five-year plan, the USSR owed foreign companies and banks an astronomical sum, about 1.4 billion gold rubles. American firms demanded hard cash, while the U.S. government prohibited granting long-term state loans to the USSR. The major partnership between the two nations began to wind down. The place of the United States as the main donor of technology and equipment was taken by Britain, and above all, Germany, whose banks agreed to extend long-term credit lines and whose companies agreed to deferred payments of 2 to 3 years. Furthermore, by that time, the Soviets were already capable of meeting most of their own equipment needs through their newly established domestic factories. In 1933, Stalin wrote, "In view of foreign currency difficulties and unacceptable credit terms, I favor opposing any new orders from America. I propose rejecting new contracts, breaking existing ones where possible, and transferring orders to European countries or our own factories." By the mid-1930s, the USSR relied increasingly on its own domestic engineering cadres. The enterprises built with foreign help were now operational, and Soviet engineers and workers had accumulated essential experience. Simultaneously, foreign machinery purchases dropped, the number of foreign specialists declined, and official propaganda increasingly emphasized the achievements of Soviet science, technology, and the working class. This transition was further accelerated by the deteriorating international environment in the late 1930s, which caused cooperation with Western nations to dwindle. Despite bravado propaganda statements, nearly 10,000 foreign specialists, mostly from Germany, continued to work in the USSR through the mid-1930s, a trend that persisted near the end of the decade. At the peak of cooperation in the early 1930s, some studies estimate there were as many as 40,000 to 45,000 foreign engineers and workers in the country. The third five-year plan, designed for 1938-1942, was never completed. By the late 1930s, the specter of impending war hovered over Europe, and the plan was executed under conditions of mounting threat. In essence, it was no longer a plan for industrialization, but for full-scale militarization. The primary objective became the accelerated development of the defense industry and the construction of military plants. It was during the third five-year plan that mass production of new weaponry began, including tanks, military aircraft, and artillery, which later played a crucial role in the Soviet war against Nazi Germany. To implement the ambitious industrialization plans, especially during the first five-year plan, colossal resources were required. The only source from which these resources could be extracted was the agricultural sector. Back in Tsarist times, grain had been the oil of the 19th century. For the Soviets, grain likewise became the primary source of export revenue, which could be sold abroad for dollars to purchase Western industrial technology. However, the peasants, having gained some freedom after the Civil War, were unwilling to surrender their grain for free, while the state had virtually no consumer goods to offer them in return. Stalin did not want to remain dependent on peasants who could choose whether or not to sell their grain. The leadership concluded that the best solution was to confiscate the peasants' property and place them under direct state control. Hand in hand with industrialization, collectivization was launched. The Soviet leadership staked everything on liquidating individual peasant farms and creating massive state-run farming units, kolkhozes, collective farms. This reorganization of the countryside pursued several strategic goals simultaneously. First, it was far easier for the state to extract fixed quotas of grain from large collective farms than to negotiate with millions of independent peasant households. The collected grain was funneled not only to feed the rapidly growing urban population and the army, but was also exported in vast quantities. The foreign currency earned from grain exports formed the very financial foundation used to buy foreign machine tools, purchase technology patents, and pay for the services of Western engineers designing the giants of Soviet industry. Second, millions of small, fragmented peasant plots made national agriculture low-yielding. The law of economies of scale dictates that the larger a farm, the more productive it is. Furthermore, individual peasants could not afford tractors or heavy machinery, which became possible when farms were merged into large entities. The mechanization of agriculture that accompanied this consolidation was intended to release millions of farm workers. Tractors and combine harvesters rolling off new assembly lines replaced heavy manual labor, allowing millions of former villagers to move to the cities. These yesterday's peasants became the primary labor force building Magnitogorsk, Dnepro-GES, and other industrial sites. Thus, collectivization turned into a ruthless yet, in the eyes of the regime, effective mechanism for siphoning resources from the countryside into the cities. The grand scale of this transformation completely altered the social landscape of the state. That was the theory. In practice, collectivization was executed through coercion, violent expropriation, and state terror. Resistance was met with brutal repression. In effect, the countryside was turned into an internal colony. Any resistance was crushed by force, while the pace of industrial construction ceased to be dictated by economic calculations, becoming driven instead by ideological goals and preparation for an inevitable, in the eyes of the party leadership, military conflict with the capitalist world. To fund the ever-growing costs of industrialization, the Soviet government forcibly extracted more and more grain every year. In August 1930, Stalin wrote, "The People's Commissar for Supply reports that grain procurements are growing, and we are exporting 40,000 to 60,000 poods of grain daily. I think this is too little. We must raise the export norm by 3 to 4 times. Otherwise, we risk being left without our metallurgical and machine-building plants." And the norms were raised. At the start of collectivization in 1929, 1 million tons of grain were exported. In 1930, that figure rose to 4.8 million tons. In 1931, it reached 5.2 million tons, after which a catastrophic famine broke out in rural regions. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that despite the horrific conditions in the countryside, the state not only failed to halt grain exports but intensified confiscation measures. Despite widespread starvation, the state enforced brutal requisition laws. The August 1932 Law of Spikelets punished the theft of collective farm property, even picking leftover grain from harvested fields, with execution or 10 years in labor camps. Due to the classification of data and statistical manipulation by the Stalinist regime, death toll figures vary between 5 and 8 million people. The famine swept through the primary grain-producing regions: Ukraine, the Volga region, the northern Caucasus, Kazakhstan, the Urals, and western Siberia. Ukraine suffered the heaviest losses, losing an estimated 4 million people during 1930 to 1933. By 1932, grain exports dropped to 1.7 million tons. Recognizing the disaster, the regime scaled back grain exports, turning to timber, oil, furs, and looted art treasures to finance remaining machinery imports. The industrialization of the 1930s left behind a complex, double-edged legacy. The Soviet Union built its industrial empire in record time. In just 10 years, the USSR transformed from an archaic, agricultural country into the world's second-largest industrial power in terms of steel, coal, machine tools, and heavy equipment production, surpassing the leading nations of Europe. Industrial giants were created: Magnitogorsk, GAZ, Dnepro-GES, Uralmash, and others, many of which operate to this day in now independent states. They formed the unbreakable backbone of the country and allowed it to survive the most terrifying war of the 20th century. The tractor factories of Stalingrad, Kharkiv, and Chelyabinsk were converted into tank assembly lines in a matter of weeks, enabling the Soviet Union to stand firm and save its peoples from Nazi genocide. Yet the primary question left by this era is not measured in tons of smelted steel or the number of vehicles rolling off the GAZ assembly line. It sounds different. Does the ultimate historical outcome justify the price paid for it by ordinary human beings? Industrialization was neither a pure economic miracle nor a simple tragic mistake. It was a brutally pragmatic choice by a state that decided to step from the 19th century into the 20th at any cost, and that cost was paid by the nation for many decades to come.